Well, I want to welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us. I'd like to introduce Lizzy. She's not a stranger at all to Winnetka Congregational Church. She has led quite a number of very wonderful, thought-provoking, and practical conversations about inclusivity at our congregation. Lizzy Appleby is a licensed clinical social worker and the Pride Share Director at Youth Services of Glenview Northbrook, and the head of air and water work. Lizzy, we welcome you back. We are in capable hands, your hands.
Awesome. Thank you for that. I am delighted to be here with everybody. This is a great, it's great to see so many folks here tonight for this conversation. That's awesome. Again, my name is Lizzy Appleby. My pronouns are she and her. I am a licensed clinical social worker by training, but come to this work, I think, more than anything as a community member. I think I am particularly passionate about the opportunities to work in North Shore communities, and especially in faith communities around issues of inclusion, making sure that everyone feels welcomed. I grew up in Wilmette, so I'm local, live in the city now, but do most of my work in the North Shore as well. So very excited to be here with you all. And I always say at the beginning of these that doing work in faith communities is my favorite, because we really get to talk about our values and really get to talk about the why behind inclusion in a way that's different than some of the other contexts that I do this work. So very, very excited to share with you this evening. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so you can see some visual that's not just my face. Talk a little bit about, so tonight our topic is talking about intersectionality, and I love this subtitle that I think it was Jeffrey gave me, seeing people whole. So we'll talk a little bit tonight about what that means, what that term is. How many people is like intersectionality a new term for, by a show of hands? New or new-ish? Okay, how many people feel new-ish? Okay, great, that was really helpful, thank you. So we'll talk a little bit about what that means, how it's connected to identity and systems of oppression and privilege. We will spend a pretty good chunk of time tonight doing some self-exploration and thinking about our own identities from this lens of intersectionality. And then we'll go to a place of thinking about how does intersectionality shape the way that we're in community with one another, right? How does it actually shape what we do in terms of our interactions with each other, our faith communities, our local communities, right? Things like that. So that's the plan for what we're going to do. A few ground rules, group agreements for our space. Jeffrey mentioned a few of these, but I always talk about this at the beginning. The first is just that I ask that we practice respect and support for one another. Everybody comes to conversations about inclusivity and identity and equity and diversity from all different places, right? These conversations often bring up a lot for us, right, in terms of what we've experienced in the past. This is a place not just for learning, but also for unlearning, right? Sometimes we're unlearning things that we've learned before. And so I just ask that we approach this conversation with an energy, right, of just being respectful of each other, supportive of each other, wherever we might be on our sort of learning journeys around this. The second is prioritizing video and voice participation. I have your faces over my slides. So I'm actually looking at all of you and not necessarily at my slides. So it's helpful to see your faces and get your nonverbal feedback and all of that. We will also be doing some breakout discussions. So we'll have some small group opportunities for folks to connect with one another and have some smaller conversation. When we're in the large group, you can either use the Zoom raise hand feature. There's like a little thing that says to raise your hand, but you can also, like, because I can see you, you can also like wave at me. And I will know that you want to share. So feel free to do that. You are also welcome to use the chat feature. I have that window open as well, so I will be able to see that in real time. So any of that is a good way to communicate, but helpful if we can hear each other's voices, and also nice to hear someone's voice that's not mine. Third thing up there, just all questions are welcome, right? Again, all questions are good questions. This is a learning space, right? So questions of me, but I think also questions of each other, right? Seeking to understand. Do share the air, so just be mindful of hearing from different voices in the space. If you are a person who tends to share a lot, maybe think about stepping back a little bit. If you're a person that doesn't share as much, maybe think about stepping forward. Speak from I and I, so speaking from your own perspective, right? That's what we mean by speaking from I. And then also, right, using I statements. So I feel this, or I've noticed this, or in my experience, I've felt blank, right? Rather than people are, or everyone knows that, right? So thinking about it that way. And then the last piece of this is just taking care of yourself however you need to. So if you need to step away, if you need to, you know, whatever you need to do to take care of you, feel free to do that. I'm not offended. I'd rather you center your bodies. We are embodied beings, so please do what you need to in that way. Are we cool with these by a show of thumbs? Do these work for people? Anything that we're not cool with? Okay, awesome, seeing thumbs. All right, cool. So let's start with identities, right? So identities are words we use to describe ourselves, right? These are both words that we claim for ourselves, right? Many of our sort of like hobbies or activities that we engage in, right, are identities that we claim for ourselves. For example, we might have some gardeners in the space. Spring is making me think of that. Gardeners or bookworms. There's a lot of talk about book clubs or other things like that, right? Those are identities that we claim for ourselves. Identities are also ways that other people understand us, right? So some of our identities are social categories, right, that other people put us into. So many of our sort of like big identities that we talk about in this context, right, like race, age, ethnicity, language, sexual identity, right, gender identity, things like that, are also ways that others understand us, right? They're identities that other people map onto us that we don't necessarily choose for ourselves. And so that's important, right? As we have this conversation, to think about, this isn't just something that we ourselves can choose to engage with or not engage with. It's something that exists interpersonally, right? Between us and other people, in that space in between, right? It's not one person or the other person. It's sort of in that in-between space. So I'm gonna, now that we have any questions about what we're talking about when we talk about identities, before I give you a prompt that includes that word. Okay, I was thinking most people are pretty familiar with that. So we're gonna go ahead and start off with a check-in. I am gonna have us do this in breakouts so that we can actually get a chance to like really talk to each other. And so in a second, I'm gonna put you in breakout groups of about 3-ish people. And I will put these questions that were on that slide, I will go ahead and put those in the chat for you so that you have them with you when you go to your breakout, and you don't have to remember them. But please share with each other your name and at least 2 of the following. So share your pronouns if you'd like to, how this week has been for you so far, what drew you to this workshop, like why you're here, and or 3 identities that you hold. And so I'm going to go ahead and recreate these breakouts so that I get a few folks roll in. All right, I lied. You're going to have 3 to 4 people in your breakouts, it looks like. And I am going to give you, 5 minutes in your breakout. So you'll see a little timer in the top. Everybody cool with what we're doing? All right, on your marks. Get set. Breakout. It worked. Mostly. Jeffrey, if you want to join room 3, you can.
Fitz is here as well. Good evening.
Hi, Fitz. Hello, Jeffrey.
Hello, I've lost you already.
Hello, I was, you've lost us?
There's no more picture. I hear you, but I don't see you. So anyway,
Okay.
I'll work on it.
We can see you, Marjorie.
Oh, okay, good.
Fitz, do you want to
Oh,
start?
there, I did it. Okay. I'm quite a very beginner with Zoom, but that's okay.
Yeah, Fitz, would you like to start?
All right, sure. I'm Fitz Anderson. identify, my pronouns are he and him. This week has been very invigorating for me. I'm really enjoying the springtime weather. I've got some exciting opportunities at work to meet a lot of new people and take on some exciting new projects. Myself and Kelly and a lot of family members have gotten their vaccine shots recently, and we are entering what feels like a new way of living. So that is very exciting. Been able to see my mom for the first time in over a year recently. That has been a wonderful moment for me and for her and for our grandkids, for her grandkids. And I'm just really positive and upbeat, which is a pleasant departure from less pleasant, less upbeat moments over the past 12 months. So I'm feeling pretty springy and energetic, and I like that actually. And I'm here just to support Kelly's work, learn more about some of these important topics, and engage with some friends at church. I will pass the ball now to
Marge.
Marge. All right.
Okay, I'm Marge Graham, and I'm a she and a her, is that right? And I'm live in California, Walnut Creek, but a native of Winnetka and Winnetka Congregational Church. And I teach for the Women's Exchange, which is connected with a congregational church. So my this week has been good. I'm finishing up seminars, one Women's Exchange and one out here in California. So I'm feeling good about finishing a long winter's seminar on actually women's spirituality, and I'm organizing new ones to start in May and June. So I'm a retired teacher, and my big excitement is like you said, it's getting back together with our grandchildren and my kids, but my daughter being able to babysit again. The core of my life is babysitting. I love it. So I'm very, very happy about having my shots and being back in the mainstream, it feels like. So it's
Yeah, good. Thanks for sharing.
Jeffrey.
Real quick, we have only less than a minute left. I'm Jeffrey Phillips, Associate Pastor, Winnetka Congregational Church, he, him, his. This week has been nice because I'm looking forward to next week when I'm off a week and I'll get to see my daughter, grandchildren, great-granddaughter for the first time in a long time. I'm interested in this topic because back in seminary, I was very interested in all of this, but we didn't have a name for it. And now we have a name for it. And I'm very excited to explore this more. JS?
I'm J.S. Hedegaard, she, her. And this week has been great, and I've made wonderful progress on many of those words that you see behind me, which are an alphabetical listing of some of the things that I want to achieve in my life.
I love those words.
Good.
Oh, nice. I love that.
Looks like we need to.
It's my crayons. It will go back automatically.
Oh, okay.
Right. Welcome. Uh-oh. Did we leave someone? I might have left someone in the waiting room by accident. Sorry.
Steve?
Yes, it was Steve. Sorry to see.
Oh.
Sorry, Steve.
Oh,
Steve was just phoning me.
You got left in the waiting room, and I'm sorry.
That's okay.
My
The
Steve.
problem is on my side. I totally lost the internet connection on my side.
Well, we're glad you're back.
I'm blaming it on Jane and her Zoom call.
Awesome. Well, I hope that was nice for folks to just get a chance to connect with each other. I'd love to hear just from a couple of people what drew people to this workshop on intersectionality? Why I heard in my small group, but curious also for folks to share in the larger group, why you're here, what brought you here?
I could share.
Great.
So hi, Lizzy. It's nice to see you again. Thanks for doing this. In our group, we talked about what drew us was really wanting to understand it more. And the 3 people who in my group also did the book Cast, which we just recently did. And so that's one lens. So you kind of move to this lens and starting to see, you know, take a more nuanced view of people as they come into your space and be aware. And that's really what we're interested in learning more about.
Yeah. Sounds like that was a heck of a book group. I feel like y'all really like did it in there. I don't know what it was, but it seems awesome. I would love to hear from just like one other person of like what drew you here. All the same reasons, I guess. That's cool too. Awesome. I'm gonna go with that. That's what it sounds similar actually to what we talked about in my small group too. So that's great. So thanks so much for landing in the space and sharing that. I'm gonna go back to my slides here. So whoop, I thought I was back to my slides. Okay. So just to pause for a second on there, right? So intersectionality is a lens, right? This is a lens for seeing the world. And a way to think about things, right? So we'll circle back to that idea. But in particular, right, intersectionality is a lens for looking at systems of oppression and privilege. And so what I mean by saying systems of oppression and privilege, I'm gonna offer this definition and we can sit with it for a second. So systems of oppression are systemic, right? So systems, directional power relationships among social identity groups in which one group benefits at the expense of other groups, right? So they're systemic in the sense that they're not just interpersonal, right? They're also looking at communities, also looking at institutions, right? These much broader systems. They're directional in the sense that one right into that last part, one group becomes more powerful and one group has less, right? So they're sort of zero sum in a sense, right? And that's why we call them this idea of systems of oppression and systems of privilege, right? Because it is both that the systems of oppression create an oppressed group, right? And also a privileged group, right? So it's not just that one group is neutral and one group is oppressed, it's that one group is privileged and one group is oppressed. And so that's what we're talking about when we talk about these systems of oppression. So intersectionality is a way of looking at how these systems intersect, right? How they come together to impact our lives. So before I dive there, questions about what I mean when we talk about systems of oppression. I think some of the most common we're probably familiar with, right? Racism or white supremacy, sexism, right? Things like that. So this graphic, which was linked to, I know it's like, there's a lot in there. So this was linked for you all as well. So, and I will in a second, I'll also share a link so you can open this in a separate window if you want on your computer as well, so you can like really look at it. But this is a graphic that really, I think, inspired this conversation in a lot of ways. Is a great graphic for looking at this concept of intersecting systems of oppression. So each of these lines that you'll see, can you see my mouse when I do this, or you can? Okay, great. Each of these lines represents a system of oppression. So for example, the system of oppression of ableism, right, has able-bodied people on one side, right? And on, if you follow it down, right, you follow down this line, it has people with disabilities on the bottom, right? So the privileged group, right, and the oppressed group down here. And what I think is really helpful about this graphic is it really paints a very bold line, right? A very bold line there in the center that it's labeled domination, right, in this space. So this privileged group, right, is in a position of dominating this sort of oppressed groups. But what's important about this idea of intersectionality, which I think somebody in our smaller group, and I'm sorry because I'm blanking on the name, brought up this idea, right, for example, that when we talk about racism, right? We're only talking about one ism, right? We're only talking about one system of oppression. And sometimes that can mean that our focus, that can be helpful, right? In terms of really talking about that specific thing and really deep diving into that. But sometimes, right, it misses some nuance in terms of the diversity of experiences that someone might have, right? If as they have multiple identities, right? These sort of multiple identities that we all hold at one time. Any questions or thoughts that folks are sitting with just as you're like taking in this image?
This is very
You know,
clear.
Lizzy, as I think about what you just said, racism, for example, one of these lines compared to others, it occurs to me they're not all created equal in terms of experiences for those who are above the line and those who are below the line. So what I mean by that is, I think if you're of European heritage and white, well, if you're of European heritage or you're of non-European heritage, I don't think your experiences in the dominant, non-dominant relationship is the same as if you're white and black or white and brown. It seems to me that there are bigger systematic things oppressing those who aren't white than there are those that aren't European. Does that make sense?
Totally. Right. So, and I think there's this piece, and I see what you're saying because I agree with you in a certain extent, right? So this idea of thinking about, for example, some of these systems of oppression that we're talking about, the consequences for being in that group that's below the line, right? The group below the line might be, in terms of people's lived experience, less severe in some ways, right? Than the experiences for other groups, right? That we're talking about.
That's what strikes me, that might be true.
Yeah, and
AIDS might be another one. I think that maybe that there might be another one that the experience, if you're white and old, I'm in that category, what I experience may not be the same as if I'm black, not white.
Yeah. Yeah. And well, and actually what you're doing, right, that is a very intersectional way of thinking about it, right? The experience of a white old person, right, versus, to your example, versus someone who is black and old, right? Even though they are both old, their experiences are going to look different, right? Because they also have this other intersecting identity. And so I will say that I want to push back just a little against the piece of sort of hierarchical thinking about oppression. I want to push back against that just a hair, because I think this lens, right, this sort of way of thinking intersectionally is not necessarily a way of thinking hierarchically. It is a way of thinking with specificity about the ways in which people's lived experiences are different. And so the needs that they might have, right, are different. And the things that might need to change are going to be different. So and I'm going to circle back to this a little bit later, but an example of this, right, to pull out of social movements that I feel particularly connected to, right? So I've done a lot of work in like the reproductive justice movement. So reproductive justice is a response to the reproductive rights conversation, right? Reproductive rights we think of as being sort of as a white woman's movement. A lot of the time it tends to be very focused on birth control and abortion access. Reproductive justice as a framework comes out of an intersectional perspective, largely led by Black women, talking about the experience of forced sterilization and the right to have children as being an opposing need, right? So, or a different need. But both of those, like all of those things are important, right? So it's not that like one is worse or better, it's that they're different, right? And they lead us to sort of different potential solutions or a more expansive way of looking at what our social justice solutions might look like. We got in the weeds there a little bit, but I think that's really important what you brought up.
Well, it's very helpful. Your explanation is very helpful, so thank you.
Good. Other thoughts or reactions that folks are sitting with? Yeah, Kelly, I see you.
Yeah, I would say when I look at this graphic, one thing that it reminds me of is there's some categories that to me have always been larger looming categories. But then when I see things on here that talk about fertility versus infertility, talk about unattractive versus conventionally attractive, able-bodied versus persons with disabilities, it does remind me that intersectionality does have such a broad lens. That it might not be things that are visual. And so I think that that's, it's startling when you see it on here charted so specifically because it's so much broader in scope than I would have initially imagined.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Jeffrey?
One reason when our senior pastor, Jeff Braun, and I looked at this, and Kelly, that interested us is the realization that in terms of age, you do go, most of us hopefully go from one line, from one side of the domination line to the other. And I remember in my own career, when I was a young pastor, I was in high demand. Everybody wants a young pastor because they'll bring in young people. And when you're a pastor and you get to age 60, not so many churches want to hire a 60-year-old pastor because of the belief that older pastors can't bring in young people. And so I have slipped or changed from above the domination line to below it in that particular way.
Mhm.
So Jeffrey, just building on that, some of these privileges eventually can go away based on life circumstances for the individual. Some of them will never change.
Mm-hmm. Totally, right?
Back to race, maybe to sex.
Yeah. And so I think, we'll sort of keep diving in here and keep digging in, but I kind of wanted to give folks a second to like land with it because I think there's a lot of richness here, right? And what's being communicated in this image. So I'm gonna ask these questions, but I'm gonna go back to the image. I'm gonna put them in the chat so you can see them because I think it's hard to hold the questions and look at the thing at the same time. But so that we can do a little bit of our kind of own individual reflection. I'll give you some time. You can jot down some notes as well to yourself. Those are the questions. As I said, I promised I would also tell you that's also a link to the image, which you are welcome to click on and open for yourself. And I'll put it back up here so we can all see it together. So questions for us to kind of to think about as we look at this. We'll just take a couple of minutes to think through these, but the first is just like noticing where you fall on each of these lines, right? So map yourself out a little bit. Are there lines or systems that are not represented on this graphic that you feel like play an important role in your life, right? That there are things that aren't. I often do this exercise with parents and ask if there are things they think their children would identify as being important that are not on here. And can you think of any times where some lines seem to fade into the background or they're really highlighted? And what do you notice about those experiences, right? Where some of those lines kind of fade and some of them come forward. So I'm going to give us a few minutes. I'm going to set a timer. So do some thinking, do some reflecting. right, take about 30 more seconds. Any last notes or observations? All right, and we will go ahead. My timer is going to go off in a second. I'm trying to make that stop. But we will, there we go. Go ahead, oopsies, at this point, and I just would love to hear maybe just one or two. We're gonna have some more time in small groups too to talk it out, but would just love to hear one or two reflections that came up for people as they were thinking about those questions. Is it Junia? Am I seeing your hand?
Yeah, people learn in different ways.
Yeah, as being like a system that's not necessarily represented on there.
I think so, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, some people learn visually, some people learn auditorily, some have a whole lot of trouble learning things, but they can learn them if presented in the way that works for them.
Totally.
So that's sort of opposite. For some people, it's just so easy. For others, it's very difficult. So those are two opposing things. And another would be caregiver and caregetter.
Yeah, like the sort of power relationship between someone who's giving care, right, versus someone who's
Well, they're opposites. I don't know what this power, but it's opposites.
Yeah. I think it's JS. Is that right?
Yeah. I don't know exactly how to phrase this, but social adaptability. That there are some people who might be below the line on several different attributes, but they have a social mannerism that makes people feel comfortable or projects a vision or power, but in a comfortable way, or it is very gentle and convincing. Whatever those attributes are, it puts them in a more of an advantageous position than those who are not sociable or socially adept or have difficulty making friends or navigating a party and chit-chatting or navigating social media. You know, the difference between a person who's got, 100 people liking them on social media versus 2 has big ramifications in terms of power and privilege within a school, for example.
Yeah, and actually often, right, so I work with young people most of the time, right, and we talk a lot about the idea of, we usually talk about it from an ability lens, like ability, disability, right, social ability versus social disability, and how able people are to connect with others. Yeah, Kelly?
I say two topics that come up for me is, I read a book recently, So You Want to Talk About Race by Ioma Luo, and she had talked about what it means to grow up in a home that is food secure, that if you grow up without having to worry or have concern where your next meal comes from, you're able to go to school and you're able to go to your job and not be combating that hunger, as well as whether you grow up in a 2-parent household versus maybe that of a, I don't know how to phrase it properly, but a 2-parent household versus a non-2-parent household, those two differences.
Yeah, right. So I think what folks are highlighting, right, and sort of their reflections is that this particular graphic, right, isn't necessarily all encompassing, right, in all of the different ways that these things might play out in our lives, but I think does give us some sense, right, to think through the ways in which different systems of oppression that we might encounter, right, the ways in which those intersect with one another. So intersectionality, the term, was coined by a woman, Kimberly Crenshaw. This is not from her original essay where she introduced the idea of intersectionality. This is a more recent article with her, the more recent interview with her kind of revisiting this concept, but I'm going to read it because I think it's good. So intersectionality is a lens through which you can see where power comes and collides, where it interlocks and intersects. It is not simply that there's a race problem here, a gender problem here, and a class or LGBTQ problem there. Many times that framework erases what happens to people who are subject to all of these things, right? So really, right, this is a way to help us think about how all those systems might play out, right, in lived people's experience. People's lived experience, that's the words I was trying to say. People's lived experience, right? So, and there's good data, right, to sort of show us the tangible aspects of this. So I want to walk us through an example that's looking specifically at earnings, like weekly earnings, especially across looking at the intersections of several different identity markers. So this graph that we're looking at right now, this is specifically looking at median weekly earnings by sex. So most of us are probably aware that there's a wage gap, right, between men and women, that men make more money than women do across the board, right? And so we often talk about this in terms of gender equality, right, that there's this wage gap. We can complicate this, right, by adding another dimension to it. So this is looking at age gap, at wages, median weekly earnings by sex, and also by education level, right? So is there a wage gap at every level? Yes. But that wage gap looks different, right, at different levels, right? We can see how that might impact people differently depending on the level of education that they have, right? So this is advanced degree over here, bachelor's degree here, some college or an associate, high school graduates without college, and this is looking at less than a high school diploma. So we can see how that changes people's experience. And then to add, right, another layer to this, right, to intersect this a little bit more deeply, this is no longer a bar chart, but it's looking at the same thing. So this is looking at women's earnings as a percentage of men's, right? So for example, this is saying that white women make 77 cents on the dollar is like a way to read this. So you can see, right, that this looks different, right, for women based on their race, right? So this is Asian women, white women, Black women, and Hispanic women. So looking at how that's different across race, and even different, right, across race and education level. So this is looking at the intersection of race and education level on women's earnings, right, which we could theoretically compare to the men's earnings that we saw earlier, right? And so what that looks like at different levels of education as well. So again, right, this is a very like numerical example, but there are many, many examples of this. So in terms of looking at, and I tried to find a great chart for this, but I couldn't. But in terms of what we do know, right, in terms of like looking at LGBTQ identities, for example, right, so that's kind of my wheelhouse. So looking at LGBTQ identities, right, we know that LGBTQ people, right, across the board are disproportionately more likely to experience different kinds of violence. But even within that group, there are varying levels of violence that people might experience. So for example, LGBTQ women are more likely to experience violence than LGBTQ men. Specifically, bisexual women are particularly likely to experience gender-based violence. It's also true, right, and we hear often in the media that trans women of color particularly experience a tremendous amount of violence, right? Because they're sitting at that intersection of gender, right, where we have male above the line, female above the line, or below the line, sorry, male above the line, female below the line, whiteness, right, above the line, being a person of color below the line, and having a cis identity, right, or being not trans above the line, and having a trans identity below the line. And so at that intersection of those three systems, right, we see a tremendous amount of violence. And so again, right, that's why this is so important, right? It helps us sort of be more specific in terms of whose experiences we're talking about and who we're centering in our work, right? Especially when we think about our social justice work. And so with whether or not, right, so whether or not we're aware of it, these multiple systems of oppression and privilege are operating on us, right, as individuals, on our interactions with each other and our communities all the time, right? So whether or not, right, and sometimes it's harder to see this when, especially when we are above the line, right? So when we are in our privilege, right? When our privileged identity is at play, it can be hard to see those systems of privilege benefiting us, but they're still there, right? Whether or not we're aware that they're happening. And so this idea, right, of intersectionality partially explains why our lived experiences can be very different from one another, even when it seems like we share a lot of common identities, right? So, for example, I could sit in a room of white people, we're all white, so our experiences should be pretty similar, but we also have all these other identities, right, that are changing our different experiences, right, and are giving us different perspectives, right, and giving us different ways to see the world. And so we're going to have different perspectives, right, when we engage with one another. So let me pause. Let me back up for a second before we go here. Thoughts, questions, reactions that folks are sitting with. Maybe just hear from like two people, kind of where folks are at. Or like what's coming up for you as you're thinking about that. Yeah, Steve Gray.
I would say with the whole discussion of racism, that it's very hard for people of privilege to understand it, and easy to say they're not racist because they seem to not experience it. But there are many things I think that those of privilege just have systemically, which they don't really quite realize, that others don't. So a simple example that I've seen of recently, especially with COVID, is kids at college. When they're all at college and they're all in the dorm or whatever and living together and going to class together, where they're from doesn't seem to make that much difference. I'm sure it makes a difference, but not so much. But when COVID hit and everybody had to go home, and then you're online with Zoom, and you see that one student is sitting in their summer home up in Maine with their own beautiful room, and someone else is down in Florida helping their mom with the hot dog truck. So those are the things you don't really realize that go on at home when you don't have any relationship to it. And tied to this would be, let's say someone is the first person in their family to get a college education, and then school's over and it's time to go out, presumably, and get on with your life and a job and that sort of thing. But many times, even if someone like that did really well in school and had lots of friends and thought it was really, many people are proud of that person, they don't have the family systems to really help them move on. And many times maybe they're back, working on the hot dog truck. It's not so easy to get a job. You don't have the connections. You don't have the family systems. You don't have the finances behind you to maybe have your own apartment or home or whatever. So those are things I'm beginning to see more readily, how different people's experiences are when something really like COVID changes the whole game.
Totally. And I think to me, right, this whole lens of intersectionality, right, invites us to even take that one step further, right, to think about what that experience would be like for a student who has a disability, a student who also English is not their first language and they want to work in the US. Right. So I think it's sort of an invitation, I think, for us to think more deeply about the ways that systemic barriers can come from all different places and all at once, right? It's not just like it just happens in this way or just in this way, but those are great examples. Thanks, Steve. Any other things folks are sitting with? Yeah, go for it.
I'll just say this has been, I think, a helpful visualization. It takes what is kind of a vague topic for some and really kind of lays it out specifically, descriptively. It's pretty difficult to argue with this framework. And I think that removing subjectivity or gray area and just kind of saying, are you on top of the line or bottom of the line? It kind of helps describe a situation. Taking away the subjectivity makes it objective, makes it almost inarguable. And then you can kind of, once you understand the situations, the playing field, then you can kind of talk about what to do about it. But it's a good starting point, I think, and it's been helpful to kind of frame it out and see it that way.
Yeah. That's almost, you said that almost directly in the same way that Kimberly Crenshaw did in one of the articles I was just reading in preparation for this, which is great. So she talks, I mean, go you. But she talks a lot about this idea, right? That intersectionality is not it's not intended to be sort of passing a judgment. It's intended to be a way to describe how things are, right? Like this is how it is. And I think you really spoke into that, right? It's a description. It's a way for us to conceptualize how the world is. So I want to go ahead and move us a little bit into thinking about what this means in terms of our, we're sort of got the conceptual piece, right? So let's think a little bit about what this means in terms of our lived experience. So I'm going to give folks a little more time to do this as an individual reflection, because I think it's really important that we spend some time thinking about our own stories. So what I'm going to ask you to do is think about a time when you personally experienced feeling uncomfortable or out of place in a group of people, or where there was conflict among a group you're a part of. For the purpose of this activity, I would encourage you to think outside of your family, but family's okay too. So it could be book group, church committee, discussion group you were a part of, if you work at a workplace, right? Any of those pieces. So thinking about a moment where you experience feeling uncomfortable or out of place. List at least 5 identities that impacted your experience. You can use your graphic to help you, but you can also include others. And if you were above the line of domination in any of your identities, how did that help you, right? Like, what did that change about your specific experience? And if you were below the line, what did that change about your specific experience? So I am going to give us, I would say, I don't know, 3 or 4 minutes, maybe even, to jot down some notes of this for yourself, because I think we'll have a richer conversation afterwards. So really dive into this. And then we'll come back together well, we'll go in small groups, but to have some conversation. Like another minute and a half. About 20 more seconds to wrap up your thoughts. And folks are coming back. I'm going to go ahead and have us in some breakouts for this discussion because I think that will be helpful. So again, I'm going to go ahead and put those questions in the chat for you so that you have them with you. But in your breakout groups, I would love for people to talk about, whoa, sorry, that didn't copy and paste the way I thought. So share your stories with each other as much or as little as you'd like to. I'm adding a question. Share your stories with each other, so as much or as little as you'd like to. Share a little bit more kind of as you're thinking about yourself in this intersectional perspective, if there's other things that are coming up for you. And then really right where we're trying to shift the conversation is into this place of how does it help you see others more whole, right? What does that mean? And what are you invited to do, right? What does this lens sort of invite you to do? What do you sort of feel called into as you think about implementing this in terms of your relationships with other people? So I'm going to go ahead. I think everyone is supposed to be, yeah, okay, great. I'm going to go ahead and move folks into their breakout rooms. I'll give you all a little bit longer this time. We'll give you maybe 7 minutes or so to share, and then we will come back together after that. Cool? All right, ready, set, go. Oops. Steve, I gotta assign you somewhere. All right, there you go. All right, Jeffrey, you can go back to 3 if you want to. Great.
It's Jeffrey.
Oh, he's back.
There. Trying to make it bigger. Okay.
If you'd rather I go back to the main room, that's fine.
Oh, no. I just assumed
Okay.
it was a different group.
Just,
Should I go first since I went last
Yeah.
time?
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
Okay. I felt uncomfortable recently because I am a homebound individual and I wanted to get a COVID vaccine in my home. And for a variety of reasons, going someplace to get one was going to be a hardship. And in the village of Skokie, they had no COVID program for vaccine program for the homebound. And it was largely based putting me in the able versus non-able category, young versus old. Those were the two main ones. Part of a power structure, the government being versus being by myself. But I am intelligent versus average or less intelligent. I am creative and I'm stubborn. And I used those aspects of domination to come up with a way of having my friends nudge the village of Skokie into realizing that they needed to have a homebound vaccine program. And so I got my jab on Monday morning.
oh, and someone came over.
Someone came over.
You did it. Excellent. That's a great story.
But I did that without dissing them and without being disrespectful of their choices. I just got them to change their mind.
Sure. Made a persuasive argument. Okay.
Jeffrey.
I was a missionary in Zimbabwe for 6 years, and most of the time I felt very comfortable, very, very at home. I would have stayed there forever, but came home for other reasons. But there were times when I felt uncomfortable because I was the only white person in a place like an African township where nobody knew me. And here I was walking through this place where white people just never walked. And I just always felt like all the eyes are on me. And this is especially true at a bus stop, a market, where the buses actually pick people up. And it was always like a mad dash to see who could get on the bus. And it was white privilege. See me and they'd say, "Sir, sir, sir, come to the front of the line." And I became very aware that even outside the United States, having white skin is a privilege. And so in a situation like that, I was white, male, I had money, I had clergy status, which sometimes people knew that I was the pastor from the mission station, or I'd even have my collar on. It was very obvious, or I was impersonating a priest. I also had the advantage of knowing the culture and speaking English. I mean, I had all the privileges, but I still felt like all eyes are on you, like you're the mannequin in the storefront window. So what did that teach me? I now live as the only white member of my family in an African-American family. And I'm often aware that I drag my partner and kids sometimes where they're the only people of color. And I wonder how they live their whole life, almost everywhere they go, as the only people of color in a group, and what that's like. And I have a little bit of empathy for that because of my experience in Africa. I see we've got just 2 minutes left.
Yeah, it fits. Here you go.
All right. The episode that came to my mind was the first day of my business school, where I had a chance to kind of meet other classmates for the first time. And I recall a lot of kind of posturing and sizing up the room, competition, kind of, bragging about where each of these people were at in life as they got to know each other, because it was a competitive situation, class rank, who's the most hireable for the top jobs coming out, a lot of success factors. And it seems a little bit different from other first days of school. I got a daughter in kindergarten and a son in third grade, and they go in and everyone's kind of in the same starting position, same age, same abilities. But in this business school, some people were, younger right out of college, some people older age. So, I mean, the disproportionate elements, education level, social ability, who's the introvert, who's the extrovert, age, financial status, who's married with kids versus who, isn't. And so it just kind of felt like, for me personally, I am more introverted, maybe slightly less socially expertise, not an Ivy League school. So, and there were other people certainly more accomplished there than I. So I felt a little bit intimidated until kind of got to know people, to break through some of those labels and identities to understand people's personalities. And that eased, I guess, some initial concern, fear, do I belong here type stuff. So, sorry for running over, but Marge, your turn quickly.
Very much like Jeffrey's experience.
I know we kind of cut off good conversation in my group, so I'm imagining that probably happened for others. A little bit, I'm seeing nods. So I'm hoping we can continue that just a little bit here in our larger group, because I think folks are really in a place of talking through, certainly their own stories, but also kind of how this is shifting their perspectives maybe a little bit, or expanding those perspectives. Jeffrey, you look so ready.
Well, Marjorie was about to share in our group. I don't know if she'd be willing to share in the large group.
what came to my mind was the memory of starting out as a tutor at the Oakland Public Library about 7 years ago. And everybody is African American, basically, and and coming into the literacy program, I was I am a literacy tutor there. But at the beginning, I felt very white, standing out like a sore thumb, very middle class, upper middle class, and very educated I'm a master's degree and a retired college teacher. And I'd come in to help people with reading and writing, but it was such a cultural difference for me. And it took quite a long time just to forget about it all and get going and make friends and have people feel comfortable with me. They were uncomfortable with me. And I just, that was my situation there, those intersectionality issues.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing.
And I was also old, old, white, middle class, educated, coming in to help the people who can't read, adult people who are trouble reading the newspaper or anything. So it was a challenge.
Yeah.
And it made me realize a lot of, get used to a lot of things and think about a lot of things. Just, that's my short version of it.
Thank you for sharing. Would love to hear from other people, especially speaking into those last two questions a little bit of what do we feel invited to do, right? As we're sort of thinking about this, how does this invite us to see people differently or invite us to engage with others differently or engage with the world differently? What's coming up for people there?
Well, I'll mention one thing. I'm a member of the Glencoe Rotary Club, and after the events of last summer, our Rotary group is small, about a dozen or 14 members, but we've thought about what would we want to do, have a program, a panel, what can we do? And one of the people reached out to a couple people in the Black community. One is a pastor in Glencoe. Another woman grew up in Glencoe. I think she now lives in Highland Park. And she came back to our group, and we're all white in that group, and said, educate yourselves as a starting point. And I think that's something we're doing tonight. Not simply in this situation about racial issues, but expansion, but educating ourselves as the first thing to do, and then go from there. And I think, several people mentioned the caste discussions that the church had, and I think that was part of a learning process.
I love what you're sharing, because I think it highlights for us a little bit, right? That sort of like bolded domination line there in the middle.
Oh, absolutely.
I think sometimes, right, it's helpful to remember that I feel like sometimes that's a little bit of a two-way mirror, where people on the top look down, and only see themselves, but people below the line can see through it. And sometimes, right, there's this sort of perception, right, that we don't even know what we don't know, right, when we're in that space above the line, right? We don't, because part of the way that oppression works, right, is that it keeps the people who are above the line unaware that the line is even there, right? So, and that's part of how it works, right? That's how it stays in power, right? And I think that's a great example, right, of somebody being like, no, like, I'm not the one, right? This sort of sense of like, no, like, y'all need to try to break open that mirror a little bit, right? Do a little bit more educating of yourselves first. Yeah, that's great. Maybe like one other, yeah, Sharon, go for it.
Yeah, in our group, we talked about gender bias and recognizing that just because you may have, in some respects, above the line attributes doesn't mean that you also aren't subject to below the line oppression. And it's something that I don't think just because you're in one category, you're necessarily excluded from the other. And we noted in our various experiences about gender inequality, particularly for those of us who started out early on in the working world. I was a lawyer when women were not welcome in the field of law. And so it is and I think this gender bias still exists. And it's something that we have to be aware of, and it doesn't go away just because you happen to have a few attributes above the line.
Totally. And I think, right, that to me is the gift of that intersectional lens, right, is that it allows us to both see our privileged identities as well as the ways, right, we still fall below that line. And that both of those things coexist, right? That it is not we are one or the other, it is that we are both, right? And this is like both and thinking, right? So that's kind of what we're hanging out with today. So, okay, so I want to go here and just kind of move us again, sort of thinking about invitation. I did some thinking myself and had some good conversations with Kelly and Jeffrey as well to think about what does this lens of intersectionality invite us to do, and offer some thoughts about that, right? So I think the first, and actually this came up in the small group I was in, was this idea of context, right? Intersectionality is an invitation to understand people within their context, right? What do their identities mean in relation to their social context? And actually, I think Sharon, your example just there was a really good example, right? Being a woman who is a lawyer when in an earlier time in history, right? Being a woman as a lawyer probably isn't always great now, but at a different time, right, in history, it would have contextually, right, that historical context really matters in terms of how that identity impacted someone's experience, right? And that has changed over time to a certain extent. Doesn't mean it's not in play anymore, but it might look different, right? So again, this is sort of an invitation to understand people in their context. That it allows us to acknowledge difference, right? To see how diverse our communities are, even when they seem homogenous, right? Even when we feel like we are in a room of people that are all basically the same as us, there are still differences, right? So many of us could identify those experiences of feeling out of place or feeling uncomfortable. And often we feel that way because there's some place where we're below the line, right? That's often a reason why we feel kind of out of place in a group of people, right? So even when we share those characteristics, we might also not feel that way. It's a permission, right, to be more explicit about the power differences that exist within our communities, right? This is an opportunity to think about if there are places where you are above the line and you know it, that's an opportunity, right, for you to think more critically about how you can be an ally to people who are not. Right? It is an invitation to recognize that, to talk about it, to name it as a thing that's happening. And it's a tool, right, to be more intentionally inclusive. So for example, let's say it seems like there's a lot of people in here who've done a lot of anti-racism work, which is awesome. So let's say there's a group of folks in here who are putting together an anti-racism event, right? We could look at that tool and ask ourselves some questions, right? Is this event open to people of all abilities? Is this event going to be welcoming and inclusive to people of all genders? Is this event going to be welcoming and inclusive to people who don't speak English? Is this event, right, who is welcomed at this event? Even if we're focusing on this thing, right, we're talking about this one system of oppression, how are we also recognizing that people who hold identities on either side, right, of that system also hold all those other identities in the circle, right? So how are we holding on to that? And I love the example, Sally, that you shared, because I feel like that this slide is really speaking into that, right? That feedback is a gift. Someone sharing their experience of oppression or marginalization with us is a real opportunity for us to see or understand something that we could not have seen on our own, right? That's that two-way mirror thing I was talking about. And so when people are sort of speaking up, right, and saying, hey, I don't feel included, or I'm left out here, that feedback, however it's delivered, right? Whether it is delivered in a way that's like feels super kind and super respectful, or if it's delivered in a way that sort of like grates your gears a little bit, it's still a gift, right? That person doesn't have to tell you anything. They could just never respond to your email. So even to take the time to share that with you, right, is a real opportunity for you to understand the world differently. And I think, again, intersectionality is an invitation for us to see feedback this way, to see that feedback, even when it's critical, as an offering of somebody else, and to be grateful for that. So let's just do some brief thinking about where we could apply this lens in the context of your faith community. So I'm curious to hear from y'all. Are there any thoughts that are coming up for people, like ways that you could see applying this or thinking about your work in the church differently? JS, is that a hand? It looks like maybe it was, but sometimes the virtual background messes with me.
I apologize. Yes, it was.
Cool, go for it.
One of the things at the church is, from my view anyway, others at the church may feel differently, and I'd love to hear, is that the ageism, it is the older who are above the line and the younger who are below the line. And I would love to find ways for that line to disappear or blur substantially in terms of how the church incorporates and listens to and solicits information and insight and wisdom from younger members of the church.
There is a system of oppression that is not listed on that graphic that I hold very near and dear to my work, which is what we call adultism, which is the privileging of adult voices over the privileging of young people, and adult concerns over the concerns of young people. So I often think actually of the age line as being more of a U, right? That we often in our youngest youth, right, start out being actually a bit below the line. And then as we age, we sort of go up and then we go back down a little bit, right? So thank you for, as my youth worker heart is a flutter over that. So thank you for sharing that. Kelly, you looked ready to share earlier. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say that in the era of COVID, when there's been so many important press briefings, whether they be medical or whether they be coming from our administration, there has been a real push for inclusivity with sign language and closed captioning that is now making me see that in a new lens as we are still in the virtual model for our church. That's making me sit back and say, oh, is that something that we should be considerate of, something that we should recognize, that, you know, that do we offer closed captioning for our virtual services? That's making me think more and more about people who are blind or hearing impaired as they are watching big, important, whether it be pandemic medical news, whether they're watching the Olympics, a sporting event, do they have ways to still take in information that a lot of us take in very readily? That I'm starting to look at that under a more inclusive lens than I did before.
Yeah, Sharon?
Kelly, you make a very good observation about the fact that there are many people with hearing disabilities, and hence we have closed captions. Sign language is something, except for the deaf, most people who are hard of hearing don't know sign language. It's like a whole different language, but certainly closed captioning. I've been working very hard to get close. We do have a hearing room in the sanctuary, and when we get back in the sanctuary, I hope it will be up and running. But I think we also may need to do more in our new streaming of the services to have captions. Right now, I could not participate in this program if it weren't for the fact that I am captioning for myself on the side. Otherwise, I can't see you well enough to read lips. So this is the only way that I can be part of things. But I think it's very important that we reach out to others. And I would like to work some with the Hadley School for the Blind to see what more we might do there to reach out to those people. They have a phenomenal program. And I think we could learn from them on how we could be more open and accessible.
Any other thoughts that are coming to folks about things that we're sort of feeling called to, or ways we could see this impacting the church community specifically?
I remember a few years ago at a church council meeting when the Boy Scouts of America were talking about admitting females. And we had a great conversation at the council meeting. Sharon might have been there, maybe some other people here tonight were at that meeting. But we kind of stopped and thought about what does this look like from the perspective of girls and women and advocates and their advocates. What does it do to the Girl Scouts of America, for example? And it was a great intersectional conversation where we looked at an issue from different points of view. And I would hope that every meeting we have at WCC, every educational event, that people who feel like a unique perspective is not being heard would feel empowered to speak up, because we recognize intersectionality in our congregation and we welcome the voice of those who have a unique perspective because of their life background. Even if at first it may not seem pertinent to the topic, if we're not welcoming everybody, then, and everybody's unique perspective and background, then we need to widen the table and widen the conversation. But this intersectionality lens gives us, in a sense, it empowers us to do so.
Mm-hmm. I did some thinking too of some strategies, right, or some specific things, right, that might be helpful. I think, especially thinking about it in that framework, right, on an interpersonal level, that when we hold people in context, we don't make assumptions about them. We're curious about others' responses or behavior. I noticed X and wanted to check in, right? Especially socially unexpected behavior, right? Behavior that seems weird or odd. That's a great invitation to say, like, what's happening for you, right? Rather than being like, God, that person's so weird, right? Like, not welcoming, not an invitation, right? Of thinking again about back to social ability, right? Recognizing there are people of all social abilities. To acknowledge difference, right? Providing a menu of options, whether or not you know they are needed, right? So that could be accommodations for disability. We've talked a lot about that in this group. Could also be financial assistance, right? Sometimes we forget, especially when we're in a North Shore space, we forget that not everyone has financial ability, right? That not everyone can afford everything. And that even people who might be upper class may not have disposable income, whether through job loss or whatever else might have happened in their life, right? That can be, class isn't always the same as income, right? So recognizing that. And all gender options, right? Providing options for people of all genders, right? And not making assumptions about people's gender, that's my space, right? But not making assumptions about people's gender, right? So when someone asks where the bathrooms are, giving them information about all the bathrooms, not just the bathroom that we think they want to use, right? But all the bathrooms. So
They're all open now, I think.
Which is great. Awesome. But then when you're in other spaces, you can think about that too, right? So own your own power, right? When you have it. Create systems for feedback that don't require the person with the marginalized identity to be the squeaky wheel, right? So how are we providing opportunities for people to give feedback that don't involve the person who's below the line being like, wait, right? How are we asking everybody, do you feel included? Do you have what you need? Are there are there things you need to feel supported in this space, right? Whatever that might be. And when we're planning events, when we're planning groups, when we're planning church services, right? Thinking about how someone with identities below the line might experience your space. Explicitly state you're welcome. I think that's so important, right? To recognize that it's not just about like knowing ourselves, right? Like I know I'm welcoming to everybody, right? That's not the point. The point is about other people feeling as though they are actually welcomed, right? Feeling, knowing, hearing, right? Seeing, receiving information, that they are also welcomed in the space, right? So being thoughtful about that. So as we are coming to, oopsies, the close of our time together, I want to offer folks the opportunity to check out of this space and share just one of the following. We've got a pretty small group, so maybe we can do it lightning round with us all together, which would be great. So either a main point that is sticking with you, so triangle, main point, a question that's circling around your head, right? That's brought up a question for you, or an action that you're being called to do. So something you're ready to do, being called into. Let's give folks a second to think about that. And if you're ready, if you want to wave at me so I know you're ready, and we can just go ahead and we'll have folks pass to each other. So I'll start with Steve H, and then Steve, when you're done, you can pass to somebody else. Cool? Okay. All right, awesome. Take it away, Steve.
So I'll go on a question side, Lizzy. We're spending a lot of time as a church thinking about what we can do in terms of social justice and environmental justice. And we believe, those, at least in the conversations that I've been involved in, that eventually takes us towards how do we address policies that create power dynamics that hurt some people. And so my question is, how does this intersectionality lens help us think more richly about what are the power dynamics going on, and how do we understand those in the systems, and what are the policies that need to be put in place to change them?
Who are you going to pass to?
Is Junia ready?
I'll pass for now.
Great.
I'm an introvert, remember.
Can you pass to someone?
Oh, to Jean.
Great.
Okay, thank you, Junia. Mine are kind of a combination of 2 and 3. So similar to you, Steve, in the anti-racism ministry, thinking about what's next. And in particular, I'm thinking about how to invite the people that are below the line, meaning not getting it, don't understand what we're doing, why we're doing it, what's the big deal, how do we think about that to try to help draw people in, rather than, they're not with it, so they're going to go underground, as a means of helping the larger issue. And I would go to Sharon if she's ready. She's probably waiting for a translation.
I just want to say, I think this has been a very inspiring program. I think you've given us all a lot to think about, and in a constructive way. And there are many things we can do to move forward. And I think you've shown us that that's true. And it's up to us now to put all this into action. So I thank you for being here.
Sharon, do you want to pass to someone else?
Julia?
I think she said me, so I'll say something. I think that the church has really done very good job of helping us understand that all people matter, all people. And I just think this is wonderful that we're doing this, and we have these 4 different threads now, and we're working hard with all of them and working together with bringing them together as well. So I'm eager to see what happens next. I was on 4 Zoom calls today, and 3 of them had to do with ageism, and no one has mentioned wisdom. And I would like to say that perhaps when one gets older, there is a certain amount of wisdom, and we've certainly heard that from Sharon tonight.
That's nice. That's nice.
I'll pass it.
Oh, I've got to pass it to
Yeah, you
somebody,
do.
right? Okay, Marjorie.
Awesome. Thank you.
Steve has his hand up. Steve, did you want to
Oh,
go?
I was actually clapping for the
Oh,
comment,
that was a clapping. Oh.
the wisdom comment.
Well, I'm not in Winnetka, and I'm out here on the west, but I have several friends, other grandmothers who are struggling and upset and confused and hurt about they have grandsons who want to be girls and who are, there's a lot of turmoil about it. And this discussion is making me feel braver about being, it says being intentionally inclusive, and hoping I can have some wisdom and support for my friends to help them with the grandchildren, because there's nothing they really are going to do about it. It's they just want to do, understand and be loving and compassionate and as wise as they can be. So that's come to my mind.
And I think Kelly,
Oh, yeah.
Steve, Fitz, Gregory, any of those people.
Steve Graham.
I like the earlier point from, was it Sally, who talked about, reaching out to others and had the advice given, educate yourself. So my thought is, even though you may think you're above the line on something, whatever it may be, don't forget that maybe in some parts of that where you think you're above the line, you're actually below. So try to be cognizant of what you don't know, or where you think, what you're missing about where you think you are.
Yeah.
I'm going to pass it to Kelly for you, Steve.
Okay, thanks.
A point that I'm taking away, Lizzy, was when you shared that Kimberly Crenshaw wrote of intersectionality. It's not a judgment, it's how things are. That's something that I'm going to really meditate on. And also, I just want to share for the group, for anyone that didn't know the origins of this topic, 4 or 5 years ago, when I began doing interviews within our church, particularly with a goal of inclusion, with a goal of equality symbols, with the goal of a new policy. It was a young person in our church, a young person that's a minority, a young person that identifies as LGBTQ+, who suggested that I consider an educational on intersectionality. And I had no idea what that meant. And at the time, this person said, what if we had a speaker that was gay and disabled? I'd want to know what that perspective is like. And I sort of walked away thinking, I need to look into that. I need to understand more of that. And I'm relieved. I think that conversation happened in 2018. And I'm relieved that if we're getting to that point now, we're in a good place, right? Because those ideas that I had 4 or 5 years ago have taken a long time. Someone mentioned bathroom signage at our church, and that took about 3 years. 3 years of me bringing that up in the meeting, 3 years of Lizzy making that suggestion to me, 3 years of a church council voting for it, 3 years of somebody ordering the signs, chiseling the signs. And now people, probably pass by them and don't even think twice. So it shows a lot of growth. And so I'm pleased that we had this discussion tonight, because I feel like it meant that we listened to somebody in the church. We listened to a minority voice, an LGBTQ voice. We listened to someone who saw a way for us to be a little bit better. And so that feels really good as we close out this discussion.
Awesome. I'm going to pass it to Sally.
Thank you. I understand, back to CAST and our discussion groups, that a survey is coming out. And I'm just wondering, after our discussion this evening, if maybe it could be broadened a bit in terms of intersectionality. I think there are so many similarities that when we get the survey, we can think about it in a broader way. And I think that'll be helpful to the church when it's reviewed and discussion about next steps.
Thank you, Sally. JS, if you want to share.
For those of you who don't know me, I'm very driven by fun and joy and whimsy, and maybe I'm below the line on that in terms of the serious nature that the church tends to use as its approach to solving problems and discussing things. But darn it all, I want these discussions to be fun. I want us to feel joyous about it. I want us to laugh, because we can still learn about serious things and be able to laugh. Is there anybody else that needs to be passed to?
There is. Gregory.
Yes, thank you. Well, this has been fantastic. And I'm feeling like I've got to share this. I wanted to do a lot of listening, but I could talk about all these, but the last one, action, I'm more than ever, I think, called to think about when the discussions and the planning are going to turn into actual actions. I mean, and it focuses for me personally more than anything else right now on our anti-racism ministry. So I know there's going to be a day when this ministry matures, and we're preparing for it. I know we're not diving in too quickly, but the Spirit is guiding us in a certain direction, and that is spending time with the greater community and being together and doing things together. That I think is going to be a place where we're all going to be, like JS said, having fun together and relating to each other as human beings, and not talking about things, just doing things, just being together. And we'll be, without knowing it, solving a lot of problems and learning just by being together.
And it's just Fitz and Jeffrey left. So Fitz, go for it.
I liked the idea for taking action around creating systems to solicit or obtain feedback without making somebody be the squeaky wheel. But that was very practical and helpful, and something I would try to implement in places where I can.
And Jeff.
Yeah, I just want to say I hope that the lens of intersectionality, which has now been formally introduced at WCC because of this, will extend beyond the 13 of us in some way. I don't know what that way is. And that, for example, these 4 threads that have been mentioned, that's environment, LGBTQ, race, and interfaith. We see that within each one, there's intersectionality, and between the 4 of them, they intersect with each other. tonight's event gives us the language and gives us the power to do so. So I hope that we'll continue that. I also, since I have the floor, want to say thank you, Lizzy, for you've been such a great colleague to work with in planning this with Kelly and me. And I think you did a great job tonight getting us started on this topic at our church. Thank you so much. You are a great facilitator.
Thanks, Jeffrey.
Yes, thank you, Lizzy.
Thank you,
Thank you all for
Lizzy.
being here. I appreciate it. Have